May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. As you know, the story of Exodus is the story of the liberation of the Israelite people from their slavery in Egypt. While they were slaves in Egypt, God heard the people's cries. God brought them out of that land and set them on a path toward a land of freedom, a land of promise, a land flowing with milk and honey. And yet, despite all that God did for the people, we hear today that the Israelites are not satisfied. This morning's passage from Exodus, they are wandering through the desert, through the wilderness, and it says the whole congregation is complaining. I've never had the whole congregation complain. I get some complaints, but this is like 600,000 people complaining to Moses and Aaron, saying that they would rather have been kept in slavery. They rather would have died than to face what they're facing, wandering through the wilderness looking for food. I will say that in my life, I have never spent a single day wandering around looking for food. I have never wondered, ever, where my next meal is coming from. Every single day of my life, God has blessed me with food, has given me a roof over my head, has given me people who love me. God has given me clothes. God has provided for me. And yet I am sad to say that often I too am like the Israelites, complaining despite all that God has done. I'm not satisfied. It seems like we always need more. There's always something new, something shiny, something better. We have to have more on the shelf, more in the bank, and more of a sense of security that we will always be okay. And even when we have these things, we are often not satisfied. The workers that we hear about in the gospel today worked all day. They were paid for the amount they agreed on in the beginning of the day, and they are not satisfied. I get the sense that this gospel and these messages today have something to do with satisfaction. You know, to satisfy something means that you meet its needs. If you are going to work on the engine of your car and you need that one specific tool to get down there in the middle of the engine, you cannot do the work without it. So that tool satisfies the need. When you've paid off a debt, they say your debt has been satisfied. You are set. And I know it's true from time to time we are blessed to look at our lives and say, well, you know, it's going pretty much as I could possibly, pretty well as I could possibly imagine. And from time to time, we have this wonderful feeling in our lives that we are satisfied, that our needs are met. Even if everything's not perfect, we at least feel that way. But it's true that those feelings can be rare and far and few between. So the question is, what is necessary for us to be satisfied in our lives? And is it possible, given that there's always something to complain about? As I've been going through this bittersweet process of saying goodbye to you guys and to the cathedral, I've been reflecting on the experience I had saying goodbye to the very first church where I served, which was 23 years ago this month, this church called St. Peter's by the River, San Pedro cerca del Rio, which was 9 kilometers outside of Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where I was a missionary. St. Peter's by the River, on my final Sunday, it was joyous. It was really a beautiful occasion. I think I have a picture or two from back then. And there are lots and lots of kids, as there are everywhere in Honduras. And I remember standing out there and just giving thanks. And also I remember so clearly the smell of burning trash. Because that church, St. Peter's by the River, and the community of people that lived around it lived in the shadow of the town's largest trash dump. They called it El Crematorio, which is basically the place where you go to burn your trash. And day and night, trash from the city would come into that dump, and the people would burn their trash, and the smell would waft over the church and everyone whose home was nearby. They could not drink the water that came out of the ground because it was disgusting yellow and green. And among the members of our church, there were people who lived on the proceeds of what they found in the dump. It was a mile away from where they were. It was very easy for them to go there and to find it. Not everyone, but a handful of families lived on what they could find with trash, metal, cardboard, wood that they collected and sold back in the city. They would find things in the trash and clean them up and sell them on the side of the road. Those who lived in the proceeds of the dump lacked what most of us would consider really your basic amenities of life. Their lives were chaotic, and they never really knew from one day to the next if they would have money to buy food, because they depended entirely on what they could find in the dump. They depended entirely on God. And yet it is not an exaggeration to say that the people who lived on the proceeds of the dump were generally satisfied with their lives. They weren't satisfied with everything, of course. They knew where they lived was very polluted, but some of them their families had lived on that same land for probably 5,000 years since the Mayan culture existed. And they're not going to give up that land for some dump. They knew that the future their children was facing would be challenging, and that the prospects of advancement for the poor are few. But again and again, I was amazed to find that the people from that church, who are Episcopalians just like we are, the poorest people you could meet in the poorest country in this part of the world, that they were perhaps as satisfied with their lives as we are, maybe even more so. At first, when I went to visit them, I had a hard time understanding when they would say again and again, "Somos bendecidos," we are blessed. And I would think to myself, well, I have to think about what blessed means. Because I came in with a notion of what it looks like to be blessed, just like we carry in our heads. What does it look like to be blessed? Over time, I got to know the parishioners who lived off the proceeds of the dump and all the members of that community, and I really found that they really actually were satisfied with their lives. Their lives revolved around their families, revolved around their friends, and more than anything, their lives revolved around their faith. Their connection with God was unlike anything I have ever seen. What happens when you live dependent upon God every day is that you get a deeper sense of God's role in your life. You learn that it is God who feeds you and God who provides for you. You learn that your efforts, as much as you might do in any one given day, your strength, your will, is only as good as what God provides. It's only as good as that next piece of plastic that's going to show up in the dump. And what happens is you learn to devalue yourself a little bit, and you place a greater value on God. You realize here in the United States, especially among the people we're talking with right now in our community, we have incredible privilege. We tend to forget that the way we live is not normal for much of the world, where about a sixth of the world live in this incredible poverty, and many more people live in other forms of poverty. Because of our privilege, we have a different sense of material things, those things that we live with. We think that our things are absolutely necessary. I can't imagine my life without my house or without my car, without the newest phone. We don't think of our possessions as gifts from God, but we think of them as our God-given right. And if we don't have them, we're not satisfied. I can't tell you how many times I've stood at the open door of the refrigerator, which is stocked with food, and said to myself, oh, there's nothing to eat. And the truth is that we have more than we could possibly use. We just don't appreciate it. When you thank God for a piece of plastic that comes from the dump because it's something you can turn around and sell, you are like the Israelites thanking God for the manna, the morning dew. When your house, which is a little house made of carton and tin and corrugated metal, is lined with things that you have found in the dump, that you've cleaned up and that you proudly display, you love every single thing you have. And you appreciate everything because they are treasures from God. After spending time in that community with the people at St. Peter's by the river, I began to understand that I in my life had perpetually overlooked the many ways that God blessed me every single day. And I began to realize that in truth, I was the poor one, not in material sense, but in spirit. Because I was not thanking God for my paycheck. And I did not thank God for money. And I did not thank God for the fact that I had eaten this day. I was not particularly grateful or satisfied with my life until I went to Honduras. And since then, my life has never been the same. Satisfaction comes when we are able to be grateful for God for everything we have. I have never been grateful for a piece of plastic I have found in the dump, but I think I could learn to be. I think that is the spiritual path that God has put me on. I am so grateful, and I've learned that gratitude is at the heart of everything I can offer this world. And I'm so grateful for all of you. I think we can learn, despite the changes and the challenges of this world, I think we can learn to be satisfied no matter what when we give thanks to God, not for the gifts we have as much for the fact of our giver, God who brings these things into our lives. We can learn to recognize that things may not be perfect, that things may not be to our liking, but that God has a plan for all things and all people that we struggle at times to understand, and we have faith. The collect that Jerry prayed this morning at the beginning of the service is really one of my absolute favorite prayers in the whole church world, and I invite you to take it out at some point. You take it out now if you want. Take it out at some point, certainly. But it's this wonderful collect because we are praying for God to grant us not to be anxious about earthly things, but to love things that are heavenly. And even now, it's while we are placed among things that are passing away, to hold fast to that which shall endure. The reminder, prayer is a reminder that the more we live according to the earthly things that will just rust, break, that we will eventually throw out, the more we live according to these earthly things, the more anxious and despondent we are. But if we hold fast to God and the promise of God's love, we will have. We live our lives in this material world. We're so used to having things and people in our lives that sometimes we can't imagine what it'll be like without them. But people and things are not eternal. Each thing and each person we have is a passing gift that we get to share as we make our journey through the wilderness together toward what will eventually become our great reward. So we love each other and we love our things, but mainly we are struggling in this life to love God above everything. To know that God's love will always be, no matter what. I think the ways in which my time in Honduras has marked me, among all of those things, it is really the wonderful fact that I've come to appreciate, after having been in 3 or 4 different churches, just how incredible the mix of people is. How amazing it is that God brings us together at these moments. God gives us these gifts. I've learned that I can appreciate each of these gifts really as a piece of heaven. So I want to thank you all, and I'll be here again for another 2 weeks, so I'm not saying goodbye, but I am thinking again about these changes and these transitions, what we hold on to. We hold on to God's love. I think God will see us through the promised land. We remember every single morning that God will give us on this day all that we need. And we know that at the end of the day, God has given us all that we needed. And we can look around from time to time and say, you know, things are pretty good. I think that's how we live a satisfied life. That we find satisfaction, God's love, peace, our lives.
Amen. Now, for those easily able, on page